Well, good afternoon, everyone. Please have a seat, everyone. How's the conference going? Well? Yes, you excited? You still have energy? It's, what time is it now? So we're now to our next panel, which is facing future threats to security, and I'm told we have a special treat. We're going to do a poll. All right, we're going to start off with this the cell phone poll. Have you heard about this? I was told you practiced? Okay. So I was also told to be prompted up there. There we go. So before we do anything else, this is what we're going to do first. So we have it there as well. Which of the following poses the greatest threat to global security over the next 20 years? Right? We have our choices: cyber attacks, violent extremism, weapons of mass destruction, state fragility, and climate change. Those are good options. And so the instructions are to text the word inclusive to the number 22333 once, and that joins you. And then you follow it with the text of the letter of your response. And you guys apparently already know all this. And of course, this is not a blind poll, so don't be influenced that D is doing so well. Have courage. Weapons of mass destruction, no one worries about that. It's just cities, coastal flooding, bioterrorism.
All the list of horribleness.
Well, so I should say, my name is Kevin Barron. I'm the executive editor of Defense One, and I'm a Pentagon reporter. So that's where I live. I live in weapons of mass destruction, but also, I guess, the rest of them. Hey, thank you. Thank you for the pity vote. Story of my life. Good. So joining our panel, this is a great panel. We've represented some government, international government, NGOs, international, American. We have Paige Alexander, who's Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for the Middle East at USAID. Ruth Caesar, founding member of Mano River Women's Peace Network out of Liberia. We have Oscar Fernandez Taranco, who's the UN Assistant Secretary General, for peace-building support, and Ala Morabit, founder of the Voice of Libyan Women. Welcome. How about a welcome round of applause? Oh. We lost the results already. Maybe we can see them again. But tell us, there we are. So state fragility wins out, 36%. We have violent extremism below that. Then climate change. Then cyber attacks and weapons of mass destruction, which is interesting and I think perhaps telling of the audience where we are right now. I'll say we do our own polls at Defense One, and we poll a different group. We poll our readers, which comes mostly from the national security community of Defense Department workers, and all these security agencies in the U.S., plus the armed services, the troops themselves. And at some level on that poll, there's also a high percentage of answers for greatest threats to global security, more in the violent extremism range, especially Islamic extremism or some other type of that blend with terrorism-ish, however it's worded depending on the poll. But I saw another recent poll too that that was a general poll of the public about a wider list of these types of answers about the number one threat to the U.S. And the top five, number 5 for the Democrats was climate change. For the Republicans, it was number 20 out of 20. So keep all that in mind. It depends on the group that you're polling. But here we are. So I'll start down the order, and I'm going to ask everyone on the panel to tell us at where we are right now, and then we'll move to where we go forward when it comes to the inclusion of women in security and peace, decision-making, policy-making, and activities on the ground. I'll start with the USAID because you're right in front of me. Paige, tell us, where's AID right now? What are the efforts that, as an organization, are done to include women? And then we'll talk about maybe some of the hotspots or success stories around the world that you have to date, sure. And then where we'll go next. We'll get to all those as we're going on. But give us an introduction, and then we'll move down the line.
So at USAID, we're looking at 2014 as being the most deadliest decade for civilian casualties, given terrorist threats that have been happening. And a lot of this involves where women fit into it, whether it's through their role in violent extremist organizations, whether it's their role as effective change agents for preventing people joining violent extreme organizations. So AID has tried to look at this through a research lens in one perspective. We have a program called Resolve, which is actually taking the research piece of it and trying to figure out what drives women, in particular, into violent extremism. This is a US government-wide offer that we're trying to work on with the State Department to try to address exactly what the drivers are. AID, particularly as a development agency, has done workforce development, job employment skills. These are things that we know will change the face of why people are going into violent extremism. But on a whole, we can't do this without taking the research of gender analysis and saying, how are our programs affecting women? How are our programs addressing some of these problems? So I say this because the state fragility really was one of the main issues that came up. And as you find fragile states, and Ala can talk about this, obviously all my colleagues can talk about this, as you find fragile states, you say, when the opening is taken up by a vacuum that we can't get into for development purposes, we can't do a normal program, we have to look at doing transition programs. Where do you have the most input on the ground? And a lot of times that's through conflict mitigation and dispute resolution. A lot of times it comes from civil society because you don't have a government to work with. And so you really truly have to rely on organizations that are doing things that are slightly outside the norm of what a US government program would do.
Okay, so we'll go from that straight down to civil society and Ruth and Liberia. So tell us from your in Liberia, how are women part of the conflict there, and what is your organization doing to change things?
Well, we all know that women play different roles in conflict, and we usually classified women mostly as victims. But women have proven over the years that they are peacekeepers, they are peace builders, they are there to sustain and maintain the peace. In Liberia, as a post-conflict country, women are very serious, very, very serious. They have their feet on the ground and their heels dug in to ensure that the peace we fought for so hard is maintained. And because of that, we do not permit, no matter what, any situation to come between Liberia, La Côte d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone, and Guinea when it comes to the peace. For example, we had the threat of Ebola. Let me start with that. Ebola was war. But we didn't know the enemy. You know, a military person will know their enemy, but we didn't know who the perpetrator was. We did not know. But we know we were in war, and we know that women were at the front line. In other words, within few weeks, the victims, 75% of them were women already. And we know that Ebola being the enemy or attack our peace. So it was not only a health issue to women, it was a peace issue, or issue of peace building. We could not go to Ebola and say, come, let's sit around the peace table and let us do conflict resolution and let us negotiate with you and let us do mediation, all those good things we've learned. No. So what did the women do? Women are born with instincts and ingenuity as mothers, as caregivers, because they were the ones who died. We mobilized ourselves as quickly as possible to use our civil society resources to do peace-building education in terms of Ebola education, education to prevent and eradicate Ebola. We work with women in the front line, nurses, mothers, and we devised simple implements. We did not have equipment like gloves. We used plastic bags on the feet, on the hands. We had to feed our children. We did not have medication, but we know an Ebola patient suffers great weakness. We use coconut water because our countries along that MRU border is rich in palms. We do not plant the palms. They naturally grow. So we are enriched with coconut, and coconut water has a lot of energy. We did not have money to buy buckets and pails to use and faucets to put water in, but we used the bamboo. And we attached the bamboo to a bucket, and water dripped out, and you were able to wash your hands. We work clearly with the Ministry of Health. We did not digress. No. We follow the Ministry of Health rules. We follow the Center for Disease Control rules, the WHO. We followed their rules, and we live within the framework. MawaNet itself operates a radio station that covers half of Sierra Leone. We have 3 radio stations in the sub-region that attaches itself at a border community and beam to all the 4 countries, and we did Ebola education. We educated the people, and we went and talked about stigma. We talk about traditions that will perpetuate the disease. We brought Christians together. We brought Muslims together. We brought traditional religion together. Now, we were not doing this in the framework of government. We were doing this as partners to government. Women have developed a partnership with government for a long time when we imposed ourselves on the peace process. We imposed ourselves to the negotiation table, and by imposing ourselves, the international community made us to sign the peace agreement. I think Liberia was one of the first peace agreements in the world where women had to attest to it to ensure that the peace lasts. So using that, using what we had, knowing we did not have money, but knowing we had a common enemy, and that enemy was a disease that we did not know. We went to war because of peace.
Like that deserves a round of applause. So compare that, if you have to compare that now to Libya. A wholly different situation.
Well, we have a disease too.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can hardly call Libya post-conflict, or women working with governments, or this, everything that she's just described here from one country seems. How much of that applies to Libya and what's the reality of the state of things there now?
Well, I'm glad and also extremely discouraged after having gotten to speak after you, just because I know everyone's expectations are going to be way too high. But both Paige and Ruth have touched on some very important things. And first, it's state fragility. Because even when battling Ebola, there was the support of the government. A government existed. It wasn't a complete vacuum. No. And that's extremely important because when you're looking at a state that has no governance, when you are looking at a complete vacuum, when you are looking at a free-for-all in terms of law and order and social justice and violence, it's very difficult to maneuver in that. Now, you look at Libya specifically, our civil society is exceptionally new. Until 2011, we really did not have one unless it was government-sanctioned or regime-sanctioned. And so you have a very immature civil society, which is doing its best to learn as quickly as possible, but still kind of going through the baby steps against very sophisticated militias, which have limitless resources, it seems, and are able to span much more of the country, and a government that does not exist, or two governments. We actually have two, which you would hope would be twice as effective, but turns out that's not so. And so that's the current situation we're in. So when people ask, what is the greatest threat, I work on, preventing violent extremism, and I wouldn't say that. I would say it's straight state fragility. Because if you have a state that cannot impose any form of law and order, then even civil society cannot work securely. We've lost activists in the past 2 years that we never imagined would be possible because you genuinely cannot leave to have a conversation about peace and security. Now, moving on to the positive. It's important also when she was talking about bringing in coconut water or using plastic bags, or the fact that the women in the region know what resources they have and how best to use them. And so even at the height of insecurity in Libya, even at the complete fragmentation of the country, you have women in communities who are bringing forth everything they can to ensure that the society at least stays together. They at least can keep the lights on. Now, even if that doesn't seem like peace and security, keeping the lights on is pretty important stuff. So I'm just going to wrap this up by bringing in what I think is the future of addressing state fragility or violent extremism or even the effects of global warming and pandemic disease. And that's not only the inclusion of women, but the position of women in the very planning and implementation of it. So when you're sitting at the table saying, what are the problems in our community? They're very different depending on where you're from. In Libya, we say it's extremism. We say it's the fact that we don't have a national army, that we don't have a peace agreement. In Liberia, it's different. In Norway, it's going to be global warming. That conversation needs to be had with the women in the community. And then it needs to be asked of them, what are the resources you have, and how best can we support you in that? How best can we ensure that your work is safe and secure, and you can go outside and you can do what you need to do in the same way that their Ministry of Health allowed them to? Because that is what is important. There are women who have phenomenal ideas and phenomenal agency, and we remove that from them. And instead, when we're having peace talks, we go up to the men with the guns, the ones who bomb the schools, and we say, can we please sit down with you and talk about how this bad guy can forgive this other bad guy for ruining the community? And we ask women to accept that. So for me, there is a question of state fragility, and Oscar, you can talk about the UN in a second, but I think it is a favor to the international community, and I think it is intelligent governance to include women, because the only way for you to address state fragility, the only way for you to strengthen your government is to have a strong civil society. And that does mean having women in leadership roles. And that, the UN system, our multilateral system, is dependent on that. It's dependent on having a strong state system. And as we can see, the UN is losing its legitimacy and its credibility because our international community is weakening. So I'll let Oscar elaborate on how he's going to save the world.
I'm just here. You can take my pad. Well, I heard several things that we'll come back to in what you just said, especially the idea of stability versus security. And I say versus because, again, in my world, the defense world, that's often how it's treated. And my experience of covering the Arab Spring years by going through the region with secretaries of defense and joint chiefs chairmen, their priorities sound quite similar to yours, where stability comes out in different ways. But I say it very often when I'm interviewed that's what's most important to the men with the guns, to the Pentagon guys, far more than security or any of the issues that go on with life beyond it. Human rights, democracy, forget it. Stability, at least cold, hard stability for United States politics, that's number one. So we'll get to that. So Oscar, you're here for the United Nations, which means you represent the entire United Nations. And everything.
Well, it's a privilege.
Tell the audience what you do, what your office does, and tie in exactly what you've heard. You've heard from a state representative, AID. You've heard from two different types of post-conflict workers.
So let me just start by saying that we are living in very interesting, very challenging times. I think this particular year has been a year when we collectively, the international community, but very much with the voice of civil society and with the very strong voice of women leaders, have been rethinking about how we do security or how we address insecurity and how we respond to all these challenges, these that came up or that were selectively chosen by the audience and many others. We are seeing a dramatic transformation of drivers of conflict and the multidimensionality of them, the interrelation of many of these different promoters, if you will, of huge displacement of population, huge collapse, if you will, state collapse in some countries and other, and the issue of constant relapse back into violence, as we're seeing now in South Sudan and Central African Republic and other places. So the issue is, how do we get into a situation of security that is inclusive but is also embracive of other concepts? This year, there have been many reviews that have placed peace building back into the centerfold, if you will, of the storyline, if you will, that in order to have security and stability, we need to be building the capacities of societies, the institutions, by actually combining the work that we do on economic development, on political development, on human rights promotion and defense, as well as peace and security. We are engaged in a very unsustainable path. Peacekeeping operations are exploding in terms of budgets, as are humanitarian response, precisely because we're doing very little of what the recent study of 1325 also particularly says is conflict prevention. Conflict prevention has not been prioritized. And when we look at the numbers, when we see where the money is going, it's certainly going to very robust military types of response to the issues that have been raised here. And that's part of the problem, is that we cannot resolve many of these problems through just a military solution, that we do need to engage politically. And this is a very important, it's an obvious one, but it's a very important element of how do we do our work different and much better. And therefore, the politics, the understanding of the political dynamics, even when we speak about the role of women in peace and security, and I think that was a very interesting point that was just made. We cannot think of peace building as something that happens after there's been a peace accord or what happens after the guns have fallen silent. It's mostly too late. Peace building needs to be the conflict prevention and how we engage throughout the life cycle of many of these conflicts, but precisely with that angle of building capacities, of empowering women. The whole 1325 agenda is basically one of women's empowerment and women's equality, aside from the many other aspects that are involved. And these are the two elements that are underfunded. These are, if you look at where we are all spending the money and where the attention and how many hours of the day that we spend looking at different parts of our job, we are underinvesting in precisely the issues that our speakers have said, to strengthen women's leadership, to be able to bring to the table in a meaningful manner, not just as a checkboxing, technocratic exercise, but to look at the politics of what's happening and localize the solutions and make them very country-specific. Our challenge in the UN is precisely not to have one solution fits all problems, is to be able to change the dynamics of partnerships, to change the dynamics of consultations, to bring the voices of young people, young women, young girls, women leaders, and to have those leaders actually participate in the design, in the conceptualization of the problems, in the formulation, and in the implementation. We manage what is called the Peace Building Fund, and actually our big challenge is to get to percentage levels of investment that actually show that we are promoting women leadership and gender empowerment projects.
What's the percentage?
So, interestingly enough, the 1325 resolution is putting 15% as an objective. We should be way higher than that.
15% of what?
And, pardon?
15% of what?
Of basically investments that we do in peace and security domains, in economic development. And you will be surprised that right now, only 2%, globally, 2% of what's going in peace and security is going to women empowerment and gender equality programs. Most is going to a military, sort of a securitized version of this. And therefore, what I think is important, again, is that we need to integrate the peace and security with developments, human rights aspects, and to basically ensure that we create opportunities for economic empowerment, that we create opportunities for political empowerment, that we create opportunities for leadership in the true sense of the word, and not to be stuck, if you will, with models that tend to be very selective and very specific in the types of response that we're doing. So it's reinventing and repositioning, if you will, the way we do business. And here, civil society, I think, is a growing, very strong voice. It was to get 1325 approved, but it was amazing in New York 2 days ago to see, for the first time in the history, I think, of Security Council resolutions, to see the length of speakers and the intensity of the commitment now to the women, peace, and security agenda, and particularly the issue of empowerment, which I think has been a little bit missing in a lot of these debates.
Did you want to follow up?
I was just going to say, when I first met Oscar, he told me my office is responsible for peacekeeping and security and humanitarianism. And he's like, but it's very small. And I was like, well, maybe it should be bigger. Like, isn't that the whole job of the UN?
It is a small office, yes.
Can I say something?
Yes.
You know,
I'm not going to stop you.
Wise man.
She fought Ebola. You better not.
we don't want it to look like women, peace, and security is trying to compare itself with military expenditures.
Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Quite far from that situation. What we are looking at is saying that, look at what we do as important to sustaining global peace, to maintaining global peace. And make sure that you support our frameworks so that we can enshrine women's roles and responsibility for peace building. So those roles and responsibility can be equally recognized by the UN, by the United States, the European government, anyone. And when you're talking about conflict, immediately you know women are part of that process of building peace. That when you're talking about negotiation, that when you are creating jobs in the UN, when you are promoting people, when we're talking at the country level, when we're talking about leadership, automatically, just how you would think on, this is a man's job, you would think on, this is a woman's job. Yeah. And to bring us in the process like it should be. Because believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, we are the fulcrum of peace. Without us, the peace we're talking about will not exist, so we should be proud and to clap for ourselves now. You know. Just as the 15th anniversary.
Okay, so if women should be part of the process at all levels. I want to get to some examples. And I'm not going to ask our USAID representative to defend the entire U.S. government. There was a major announcement today, and then this is what I've been racing to and from all day. When President Obama announced the extension of troops in Afghanistan, the war there now entering its 14th year. Our headline is "America's longest war just got longer." This wasn't supposed to happen this way. This was supposed to be on its way to peace, that the entire Afghan society was supposed to be trying to come together and drive out the bad forces. Major efforts to improve women's lives, girls in school. We know a lot of those metrics and a lot of that data. But talk about what we just heard about how are women being included, sometimes I think against the will of the governments that they're being included in. Or at least in some of these societies, to get to these next levels of peace amid conflicts that are long-standing, cyclical, that don't seem to be getting better.
So taking on the whole government and defense of the whole government.
Next year we'll have John Kerry.
So I would say on Afghanistan, USAID has the largest women's empowerment program called Promote in Afghanistan. It's $216 million, and it is the largest program we have. Is it too late? Should we have done this earlier? Very possible. Not my region, but I will tell you we are looking at this as an example for Syria. But I also look at Kosovo. I see the ambassador to Kosovo is in the audience. I look at Kosovo and the Balkans experience we had. We came at that slightly backwards. I would say that when I was in government in the 90s working on this, the end state of the military and the end state of development professional are the same thing. We want peace, we want security, we want empowerment for everybody. How we get there is two different tracks. Back in the Balkan days, we would not work effectively with the army or with the military. In fact, they would call it mission creep if they were doing some of our work. We don't have that now. We are lockstep towards an end state in Syria and Iraq. I spend more time with military colleagues than I ever thought I would as a development professional. And so I think that what we're trying to do is marry these. We're trying to marry them and find the synergies early on so we don't end up in the world's longest war. We don't end up with Syrian refugee crisis. We don't end up with children who have been out of school for 4 years and counting in Syria and will have trouble getting back in school. So we have to find ways to address this through non-formal education and through the means that bring people together. And it's both the military, civil society, human rights activists, and the formal sector that is set up. And Libya is a perfect example. Syria, Yemen, you create these crises, you end up with humanitarian vacuums that we can't go in and do anything unless we're doing it together. So we've learned a lot of lessons, and this is really what we're after as we look at trying to fix mistakes or trying to address issues that appear to be sort of chronic. I mean, they're not just acute problems, they're chronic and they're going to be longstanding.
But again, get to the specific of then, or maybe prioritize. Is it, if it's right to prioritize, what's more important, trying to get women at actual negotiating tables? So, the talk today is the Taliban. Are they going to actually still come to any kind of peace table with the Afghan government? And making sure there are women there, if they're not already in the positions that need to be, if they're not already in the equivalent State Department positions of those countries, right. Versus changing the grassroots, the ground level feelings, traditions, morals, values of cultures to somehow work from the ground up to that point one day.
It's not an either or. They have to meet.
Exactly. Why do you have to choose?
Yeah.
I mean, when we look at military offenses, we don't just say, well, we're going to aim from the sky and we're going to go boots on the ground. We do it all. In that, we're able to multitask. But when it comes to ensuring women's inclusion, suddenly we're like, wait a second, there are two women.
Yeah, but the difference is $5 billion versus $216 million, which
I agree.
And pennies.
I agree, and that's what I'm saying. I'm saying sometimes what we look at when we're talking about women's inclusion is we're not just saying women have to be at the table. We're also saying we have to create social structures which ensure that women's voices are heard. Right. So if in some societies that means it's very difficult to have a woman be the prime minister or the minister or the president, I'm not saying, but in some of those societies, at that point we then use networks and we then use coalitions, and then we go and we talk to people who do have social influence within the community. So in Libya what we did was we worked with religious leaders. Mm-hmm. We worked with religious leaders because we know those are the voices that people in the community listen to. When push comes to shove, when for the past 42 years you've been under dictatorship and now you're under a civil war and you're worried every day that your children are not going to go home, God becomes your best friend. Mm-hmm. And so we went to those people and we said, listen, religious leaders agree with us. Women should be included. Women should be part of peace and security. Violence is wrong. And that had many more people agreeing with us than us just saying, well, it's right. Women should just be there because they're women. They're half of the... It just wasn't enough. So I think it's creating social structures and at the same time institutionalizing those. So it's good to plan and to implement a project for a year or two, but it's better to create structures. 1325 was policy. It said women should be at the table because it is better for society. And it gave evidence of that. And we need to institutionalize that in all ways. And I'm so glad you brought up young women, because young women are so often excluded. And I feel like if we're going to be realistic about ensuring that this agenda is taken seriously in the years to come, we as women's rights organizations, but as a larger community, as a development community, as a political community, as a military community, need to recognize the agency of young women. And we need to ensure that we have young women at the table, and we need to ensure that we have young women's voices at the table. Because in a lot of these conflict countries, we find that the people who end up taking political positions are much younger. In a lot of our developed countries, people are getting much younger.
So Oscar, then what are the countries that are doing it right? Who are the leaders in this field that are setting the examples?
Well, coming from where I'm coming, it would be a problem to start pinpointing countries. But let me talk about what should be happening. We're live stream straight to New York. I think it's important. It's important to stress, I think, that element that we need to build social cohesion. There needs the social contract of countries is extremely important and powerful, and women are maybe the most fundamental part of that glue, is that it's what holds countries together at the end of the day. And social cohesion is built by building the strength and capacity and the mobilization factor of civil society, the forces of civil society, if you will. But you need institutionality as well. You need to regulate precisely that political realm, of which women also are very active participants and have even differences in political opinions and whatnot. It's very telling that much of the work that we do to prevent electoral violence in the fund that we spend and use and target is precisely to involve women political leaders as mediators among political parties in West Africa. The Cas de Vey in Guinea, the elections that happened over the weekend, in great part, the lack of electoral violence in contested and very close elections has been due to the investment we have been making to promote women leaders as mediators, not in a negotiating table, but literally walking across that street and with the courage that has been already very much talked about, going courageously across armed militias and whatnot to try to get everybody to focus on the need for the country to go forward. Now, the issues that we face and why is fragility coming out is the notion of legitimacy, the legitimacy of state institutions, the credibility, and what we see through corruption, through the impunity, through the injustice, for the incapacity of the state to deliver basic social services where they are most needed. And these basic social services, childcare, healthcare, education, this is what allows women to become empowered. So when we talk about empowerment, it's not just a seminar and let's take the picture and the photo op of people sitting around the table. It's what happens back home in the communities, in the very remote communities. And why are we having problems of some of the countries that have been mentioned? It's because, again, the international community and the United Nations, the big challenge is always how to get out of that capital city and how to find the real voices, the influential voices that makes a difference between participation or repression, between marginalization and exclusion, or actually making it so that it is everybody's as a societal project. So, for example, in security sector reform, since we're dealing with inclusive security, most of the relapses back into violence have a lot to do with the fact that we don't bring women into the security sector reform, into the justice system, into the police forces, so that reducing gender, sexual violence at the local police stations and to have networks to prevent, and not to see women as victims and, but to see women as active participants in prevention, in going to these traditional leaders, in getting the militias demobilized. The Colombia peace process, bringing women of all political ideologies into that negotiation table, has everything to do with whether these peace agreements stick or unravel very, very quickly. And they tend to unravel because we are not inclusive in the way that we bring people into the discussion. We tend to work with the people who agree with us, with the people that have been educated and have cultural reference points, but they might be absolutely insignificant in some of the countries where we're working, where for lack of institutionality and for lack of inclusiveness, we have a totally different social reality that we need to speak to and react to. And to do this, we need to be out there listening, learning, and not imposing models and not saying this is how peace is going to come to this place. Peace is born in the hearts and in the minds of the people themselves. And this is the space that in the UN we should be giving much more. And we are not, and we're failing, and we need to do much more. We need to acknowledge what's not working.
So in our final 2 minutes left, Paige, this is your chance to make your big ask. What do you need now? What's your most urgent request, if you can make it?
Because I deal with so many humanitarian crises, I would say that a real attention to making sure that we start out smart in the humanitarian sphere. So we make sure that when we go into, whether it's an IDP camp or it's a new crisis situation because of bombing, that we make sure that women are part of that, because war is not good for anyone. But when you start with people who are that much more in distress, and then you have gender-based violence issues, you have women who are being mistreated, it seriously steps us back, and we can't build from that. So my big ask is more research into looking at the specificity of how humanitarian assistance across the board can really address the issues that are important to women so we can build from there.
Ruth, for you,
Two things.
we're listening.
The first is that the planners and developers, UN, listening at the Security Council, at all the species, should now realize that all issues to women are hard issues. The issues that development planning classified as soft issues, education, health, social change, economics, livelihood issues, for women, they are very hard issues. And they are the issues that are the fundamental of peace. Because peace, according to the Arusha Declaration, is not just the absence of the sounding of the guns. We need to consider that. Another thing is, you talk about the peace building fund, 15%. I wonder, seriously, how many of your peace missions and your peace building fund offices in our various countries understand and know this? You know, communication is power and is money.
Absolutely.
We could not asset that money in Liberia as women to do what we were supposed to do so. My last comment here is that one of the results that should come from out of all these discussions is a clear policy and a clear instructions to all your missions and all your peace-building offices to make sure that the women in our country are informed. Absolutely. And the Ministry of Gender are informed about the peace-building fund, and that the peace-building fund must be used.
Absolutely.
We must use it. So that my last, because I need to use that fund.
I think we should all do what Mama says. A round of applause, please. We're out of our time. Thank you.
Thank you.